Okay, I think we're just about ready to get started, so welcome to everyone who's just joined us. So the next presentation is from Frank Drews from Oxford Computer Group, talking on hybrid identity design and privacy issues. So over to you, Frank.
Great, thanks, Tom. Good morning, everyone. Okay, so a little bit in the way of background, I'm a senior architect at Oxford Computer Group. Oxford Computer Group we're a bit of a boutique consulting agency. We do a lot of work in identity and access management, primarily around Microsoft technologies, although, we work with customers deploying a variety of different products. So in my position, I really work a lot with the products themselves, what I call the framework. While this presentation is really more about what's contained inside of it. So I think of things, people who are deploying tools like an email system or a SharePoint system, and a lot of time we spend a lot of time thinking about the framework, but we don't think a lot about the contents. And so this is really more about what's actually inside of these systems and some of the privacy concerns about them. So for me, this was actually a pretty good learning experience. These are things that, although you're kind of aware of them on the periphery, they're not really part of the core thing that I do. So I think I've probably learned as much as anyone here. So first, let's kind of talk about what we're going to cover agenda-wise. So the first thing we're going to talk about, we see the term hybrid identity. How many people here would say, I kind of get what that is? Okay, a few. So we're going to spend a little bit talking about that. And so, with this particular model, what are some of the potential privacy issues related to it? Some examples that I've seen of things where people have got themselves in a bit of a pinch, and some design recommendations. And anytime we talk about design recommendations, especially for things we've already deployed, there's things we can do today, and there's things we can do in the future. Most of them tend to be toward the future because when you have systems in place, you don't change them overnight for lots of good reasons. We're going to really, really quickly, and by quickly I mean like one slide's worth, talk about how GDPR and its privacy kind of restrictions and concepts and regulations kind of tie into identity, because a lot of times people think about privacy, they think of information that's stored in databases and other locations, but let's talk about what we're actually storing in identity systems that could have implications with that. And then we'll try to leave you with as many things that you can take back to your organizations and say, this is something that I can do now to kind of reinforce those concepts. So the first thing is kind of define what hybrid identity is. So any good identity system has the idea of a single identity for people, regardless of where you may exist in different systems and your accounts and logins, that we actually have a central identity that we can point to. And in the hybrid world, we kind of see that as being in two places. One is on-premise, right? In an on-premise directory, we've been using these for decades now, usually LDAP, Kerberos-based, things like Active Directory and Oracle OIM. And then also the idea of a cloud directory, right? And these are based on newer protocols and concepts such as OpenID, SAML, WS Federation. And so the question is, why do we actually need to have two different systems, right? Well, it turns out that both of these systems are really good at serving applications either on-premise or in the cloud, but they don't necessarily work that good between. So what works really well for securing file shares, printers, managing computers, works really good inside of our four walls, inside of our firewall, but not necessarily really good out on the internet without exposing things like central authentication service to the web, which we just wouldn't do. While cloud directories work really good when you're talking about services that are shared among a lot of different customers. And so we find that neither of these is perfect for every application, but using the one that kind of matches what we're doing works really well. Now, remember we had the idea of one identity, even though we have multiple actually account stores. So we need some sort of synchronization process, right, to keep them kind of connected, so to speak. Many times these kind of use the on-premise directory as the source, although what we do find is we're kind of moving toward a bi-directional where either source can be your authoritative source. But for the most part, most things kind of originate on-premise and then get pushed up to the cloud from there. And these products allow you to do partial synchronization of both objects like users and computers and groups and such, and their corresponding attributes. And unless we kind of take some steps to do otherwise, the default is sync most or all of everything, all the object types and their attributes too. So we end up with pretty close to having a mirror of what we have in one directory with what we have in the other via these synchronization tools. Okay, so what are so now we have the containers in place, right? So what are some of the potential privacy issues of what's actually inside of these directories? And why do we run into it? So what we do, we see there's lots of attributes about people, and mainly privacy is related to people, of course, that really shouldn't be in there. And many people would agree with me with this, that a good design concept is your directory should be what I call fairly sparse. It really only needs to have what it needs to have, right? And the less information you have, the better from a lot of reasons, from not only scalability, but we'll talk about security and privacy. So what we see is there's lots of user data attributes that are put in directories because it's easy, right? And many times it's put in there really without thinking what some of the privacy impacts are of storing data there. So for example, you may have an application that needs certain information about people that going to other authoritative sources like an HR database might be complex, so why not just throw it in the directory, right? It just makes it easy. Well, we'll talk about how easy doesn't always kind of map to good privacy. So some examples of information that I've seen in directories are things like people's gender, date of births, marital status, home addresses, home phone numbers. This is absolutely not the sort of stuff that you should be having in your directory, but you see it out there a lot. In fact, there was a situation at one company where we were going through and trying to figure out some performance problems. We were looking at queries to try to figure out, well, maybe it's inefficient queries that are causing some of these performance issues. And throughout the thousands and thousands, one looked very unusual, so I dove into it a little further. And the actual query was, show me all people whose gender is female, whose date of birth is after 1970, and whose marital status is not married, who are in the same office that I'm in. And you can only imagine if that led to some harassment, and then they said, well, how did you find this information? Oh, it's in our directory, right? Somehow that fortunately never came, but you can imagine being, answering the questions about that, right? So to kind of expand on that a little further, so why aren't directories a good place to put that? Because pretty much everything you put in a directory, the default settings anyway, are that anyone who's authenticated user, and even in some cases non-authenticated user, anonymous users, can see most, if not all, the attributes about other people. While it is possible to put security around that, very seldom implemented, one, because of performance. You put a bunch of ACLs on attributes and suddenly your performance kind of takes a dive. In fact, that's usually one of the first things we turn off when we have security performance issues. And then just plain, just it's easy, it's convenient, we don't think much about it, we just do it. And a lot of things in IT that go badly kind of start that way. And the idea of when you put things in a directory, the idea is you want to share that information. Openness and sharing is really kind of the design of a directory. And that's really what directories are and what they're for. And so if you take the same information to the cloud, you have a lot more potential visibility. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And one of the reasons people are moving to the cloud, and part of what the underlying directories help support, is the idea of sharing information between organizations. In fact, when we talk about some of the things that you get from moving to the cloud, many times one of the first things we talk about is how easy it now is to collaborate with other organizations. Also, some other thoughts, and these are kind of design principles as well. Thinking about who's in these directories, right? Our employees, kind of obviously, right? Contractors, almost always. Third parties, pretty frequently. Customers, sometimes. Sometimes you'll see models where, it's just an amalgamation of lots of different types of people. And then, so what are some of the things you can kind of do to kind of get out of that as well? One is to, as much as possible, just store information about people that, what I call you're responsible for. and people who you don't necessarily are able to speak for. As much as possible, if we can move to federated identity concepts where we take identities that exist in kind of their home systems or their home directories and use their identities to authenticate, those are much better kind of designs for a couple reasons. And one is it reduces, I call it your culpability and risk of cases where, let's say someone who's been terminated is still able to access applications, right? It doesn't mean it won't happen because the home organization could be as forgetful about updating people as you are, but it really kind of puts the responsibility on them to kind of maintain that. Told you we're going to talk really quick about GDPR, and this is really, you've probably heard about this in other presentations, but a couple things to think about is anyone storing user data about EU citizens is within scope. There are a lot of people say, oh, that's an EU thing, doesn't apply to me. If you have anyone in your directory who's kind of within that scope, then yeah, it applies to you. And as much about the data itself, it has a really kind of strong aspect about allowing people to make choices about how their data is used. So when you look at the part about respecting choice and so on, that's really key to it. And again, mentioning no matter whether data is sent, stored, or processed, even if it's on the other side of the world, if those people are within scope, then these things apply to you. It's already out there. I mean, people are thinking, well, isn't that something that's coming? No, technically, it's already in place, although we do have a bit of a phase-in. And when you look at the interesting parts, which are the non-compliance, they're not small beans. It's a really significant kind of numbers. So when we think about this, what are some things that we can do, to kind of mitigate some of these? So for one thing is, if in your organization, how many people here in your organization have someone who has a title of a chief privacy officer? Some? Few? Very few? Okay. For one, go find out who this person is if you haven't met them already. Because you usually think of, oh, that's privacy, that's all data in HR and other systems. Yeah, there's a good chance that data that's in your identity systems is going to fall under this. Even though they may not have thought about it yet, you may want to get on the front end of that. And see what, if any, of their controls that apply to your organization apply to your information. So that's kind of the soft side. When we talk about the technical side, one is take a look at your directory. Look at the different attributes that you're tracking, and also look for hidden data, because many times people will put things in your directory in places you wouldn't expect to see it. They'll take some of these really kind of odd attributes like telex number and stick information in there. So, go through and, look at the actual data in the directory. You might be surprised at what's hiding in some of these attributes that you wouldn't think things would be stuffed inside of. Also, another concept here is think about what I call intended use of attributes. To avoid one attribute that you think is maintaining information for one reason when it's really being used for something else. A quick example of that would be, let's say I'm storing people's mobile phone numbers, and I want to have a password reset solution that uses mobile technology to let people reset their passwords. So it's real tempting to say, well, I'll just use the mobile phone number field because that already has a mobile phone number field. However, it may be that people may want to use a mobile phone to reset their password, but they may not want it as published data in a directory. So it may actually make sense to have a mobile phone number that's published and maybe an authentication phone number that's used somewhere else. So by actually classifying data into attributes that kind of correctly map to what they're used for, that may avoid some of the things where you think data is used one way, but it's really used another way. Because another thing about privacy is it's not always the information itself, but a lot of times it has to do with the context, right? A phone number by itself may not be necessarily sensitive when used one way, but it may be sensitive when used another. Some more follow-ons. Also, remember we said that these hybrid technologies have the idea that we have synchronization tools connecting one directory to another. So let's take a look and make sure we're only synchronizing things that we need to get into these directories for the applications we're supporting. Because remember, a directory by itself is kind of useless unless you use it to sign into something, right? Otherwise, it's just a username and password. Access to applications is the actual usefulness of it. So remember we said that the default configurations of these synchronization tools are designed to get things deployed really quickly, right? when people are trying to get you to the cloud, they don't want you doing an IDM project. They want to get you into the application as quickly as possible. So they're going to roll out configurations that are quick and easy, right? Tuned for fast deployment. And they're really not necessarily thinking about privacy or maybe not even security. And typically, you know, a lot of these have the really kind of quick wizard, you know, the easy install, but they all always have that little advanced button they don't want you touching, right? It lets you get in there and say, okay, you know, these attributes I need for email, these I need for collaboration tool, these I need for instant messaging. Maybe think about going in there and saying, oh, I'm not using these applications, I don't need to synchronize these attributes, and potentially turning them off as well. So the concept is enable only what's required, right? The kind of the sparse directory concept. So what you'll probably end up having, especially if you use your on-premise, your source, that your cloud account should probably only be a subset of the things that you maintain up in the cloud. Another thing is a lot of times, and we find this a lot, we get called into projects where people have already kind of followed the fast track and they had that issue, right? They had a breach, they had information leakage. So we have to go back after the fact and kind of change things up. The important thing is anytime there's already a deployed production system, even the changes you don't think are going to hurt anything might. So, you know, be really careful, you know, think about, you know, staging these in testing environments before you, you know, go rolling these things into production. So some other concepts here, we're going to roll through these pretty quickly, is when you look at cloud directories, one of the things you can configure with them is what attributes get sent to a particular application. Typically, these are, in federation technology, known as claims, right? And so a really important concept is not all applications need or even should have the same data, especially for a lot of the applications that people write themselves. Another really good privacy concept, and this applies really in the federated kind of the cloud identity space, is the idea that I can have a kind of an anonymous identity that really only says that I'm a legitimate person in a system. An example, we worked with a school says, worked like this, that said, we've got a bookstore that we're working with that's going to give 10% off of any books for students who are enrolled in the finance department. So we actually set up the application so that when a person authenticates, they get a consistent random ID number assigned to that user. So that the person at the other end, really the only thing that they know about the person is that, one, they're a legitimate user and they're enrolled in this semester in the finance department. So at that point, you know, we remove any kind of personal information kind of from the equation. So, you know, some of these concepts, you know, really kind of extend those privacy concepts even further. So kind of in closing, so what can, you know, we kind of take back to improve our position? So again, we talked about, you know, look at the data that's in the directory. Most of us really are in charge of maintaining the container. We don't think about the content. So look at the content, right? If we see information that looks like it's privacy sensitive, you know, think about how we can get that out of there. Think about, you know, what we can do today, and think about what we can do longer term. Because a lot of times when I say longer term, you know, if I have a new app that's relying on data in the directory that shouldn't be there, I probably can't change that until my next revision of the application. So I need to start kind of planning ahead now for that to happen later. And also that concept is, you know, what you put in the cloud, especially because of its visibility, you know, it should really be a lighter weight replica of, you know, kind of what you have out there on the, out in the cloud. And so that's kind of the end of the prepared remarks I had. There are kind of questions about this concept, and can you, right back there, if you can grab in the mic.
Yeah, thank you. I think your cautions are well taken and good advice, but there's one thing I'm tempted to disagree about, and that's the premise that the directory is not a good technology for storing the privacy data. And there's two main reasons for that, I think, that maybe you can respond to. One is, of the data storage technologies out there, the directory, if it's well deployed and has the right features built in and it's correctly configured, it's about the only one that allows a separation of administrator access from the data itself, right? So just the issue that an administrator of the container can see the data is a risk, right? And a well-provisioned and deployed directory doesn't have that risk. The other is from a privacy point of view. If you take the private and personal data out of the directory and put it elsewhere, it's much harder, I believe, to do control and audit and governance over the usage of that data. If you do have it in a central place, wouldn't it be easier to control the access to it and respond to audits about how that data is being used and handled than if it's distributed widely?
Yeah, that's some good points there. A couple things. Although there are ways to kind of secure and audit, what's being pulled and read out of directories, I find it's usually not quite as advanced as some of the kind of identity governance tools that, or even kind of data access governance that may exist in some of those systems. I think if it's really well designed out and thought out ahead of time, I think you can achieve some of those objectives, but many times that's not how we get there. It just kind of, things kind of get thrown in without a lot of that foresight. So I think with the proper planning, you can probably meet those objectives, but realistically, a lot of people kind of don't get there. There are some definitely advantages of having it in the directory, especially when you look at performance, especially if we try and rule out the security side of it. And unfortunately, when we try to, a lot of times we try to apply some of the security and also some of the auditing on directories, sometimes it kind of brings things performance-wise to a pretty bad state. But yeah, I think with the proper planning, you could probably pull that off. But some good points there to consider. Other questions? Right here.
So in your experience of companies separating out that personal information, what are kind of the successes of getting that information then back into those end applications that do require it?
Okay, so I'll go back to that example I talked about, why all that really personal information was in there. In that case, it was actually to support an application that allowed people to sign up for benefits once a year, right? And it was just really much more convenient to put it there because, well, it's already in HR, I can sync that in the directory, and then my application can more easily access it. So it was really convenience, so it was much quicker to get there. Now, the answer for that one was to actually get exports from actually a couple different systems and actually pull them into the application. But it did require them to go back and re-engineer the application. And you can't just say, oh, you can't store this information here, we need to do something, because those are typically long lead time items. They say, oh, yeah, that's true. Maybe we can do that for next year's release. And they basically went to, the authentication was just for the login, and then they got a data feed that came separately into the application. And they actually felt a lot more comfortable that the data was moved that way because they could actually do things that prevented the administrators from actually seeing the data itself, which is really kind of hard to do in a directory.
So as a practice, kind of how do you balance the complexity of maybe doing file extracts instead of through a nice seamless synchronization process with the PII?
Okay, so the question was,
how do you successfully do that?
yeah, how do you successfully do that? It's really that your application, well, in this particular organization, it's really important that the people from all the different parts, the data owners, the application developers, the directory folks, all really kind of get together and do it as a team. Because whatever team you're working with, they're going to kind of do what they think is quickest and easiest, and their kind of view of the problem is really kind of focused around their technology. They don't always consider or even know what other technologies can or can't do. So really making it a collaboration between multiple teams is the secret to making that happen. Okay, got another one here?
You may be able to just confirm, but I'd heard under the GDPR, one of the obligations was that companies had to have an auditable trail of where they'd made design decisions. So going back to the point about whether or not what type of data you keep in your directories, is it not the point that whether you have multiple fields with multiple bits of information, it's about protecting it appropriately as opposed to whether it's there or not?
Correct, yeah, GDPR, like I said, what I put in one slide doesn't even begin to touch the aspects of it. Really just to think about that, things that we're doing in the directory may have impacts in there where a lot of people may not be considering that as a place to, start thinking about. They're thinking about other places data is stored and accessed, and they may not be thinking that, hey, this may apply to me as a directory person. So it's really kind of an awareness thing rather than a complete treatment of the subject. I couldn't even begin to do it justice. Good points.
Any more questions? We've probably got time for one more. No? Okay. All right, in that case, thanks very much, Frank.
Very good. Thanks, everyone.